Hello, this is the Arirang Institute podcast. I'm your host, Michael Ambro. Today we will be discussing how communists negotiate. Now, I put together this particular podcast based off of the most recent news that the U.S. and North Korea might engage in talks, or at least that North Korea is willing to. I heard even over the weekend that the words came from the mouth of Kim Jong-un himself, and so that must mean it is true. So going forward, at the beginning of this, you can see that the book that we are looking at is called How Communists Negotiate by Admiral C. Turner Joy, U.S. Navy, retired, with a foreword by General Matthew B. Ridge, and this was published in 1955. So I'm going to go through the book here with some very, very interesting observations and analysis of North Korean negotiating styles. Now, this is not only just the North Koreans, but this was the Chinese, the North Koreans, and then the U.S., the UN delegation, and South Korean um, military professionals, right? The South Korean generals. And the book is, the book's very interesting. It's pretty straightforward, easy read, short, and I was lucky to find it when I was looking for it. I think when I was doing some research recently on a while back about North Korean negotiating strategy. Scott Snyder also has a book out, something about the edge and back. I'm not quite sure, but this is a important topic going forward, especially for the United States and her allies. What's going to become of these uh, negotiations? What can we expect from the negotiations? And for the Trump administration, or at least those involved in the talks, what are the negotiation tactics? Now, General or Admiral Turner here speaks about how communists negotiate, right? Admiral C. Turner Joy. But communism was a new ideology, it was a new belief system that had come into fashion, so to speak, but it was dominating, right? So you had the Soviet Union, you had communist China, communist North Koreans. But you have to understand that when these new ideologies come in, the language is assumed, the language is absorbed, right? Comrade and all this kind of language, and the people's movement, but cultural mores and cultural ways of being and the hierarchy of values and how to conduct negotiations. I would suspect that these type of um, long-term values are much more difficult to change and adapt quickly. So going forward, we're going to look at this book. It's quite interesting. You can look at the cover there. It says like 2 plus 2 equals 5, not 4. Right? And so it's basically to Admiral Turner, none of this makes any sense, right? He's coming at it from his perspective, from his cultural perspective, and it just doesn't seem to make sense to him. And extremely, extremely frustrating, I would imagine. And that's what you do with negotiators, right? You send them in, you negotiate, and before they sort of make a mistake, they usually, if they make a mistake, it's most likely because they get burnt out, right? But and the U.S. has to be very careful here going forward, which is, as we spoke about in previous podcasts, North Korea, nothing's off the table, so to speak, in negotiations. Anything you assume is on the table, or you assume to be normal, or you assume, okay, we're going to stay at this hotel, we're going to walk in through this door, I don't have to worry about any of that. You better be prepared to worry about everything, right? And we'll talk about this, right? So not me, but Admiral Turner. So I'll read a few lines from his book. They're quite, they're very informative. So the first part here, he talks about setting the stage. The communists had provided a chair for me, which was considerably shorter than a standard chair. Across the table, the senior communist delegate, General Nam D, protruded a good foot above my occasionally diminished stature. This had been accomplished by providing Stumpy M.B. with a chair about 4 inches higher than usual. Chain-smoking Namil puffed his cigarette in obvious satisfaction as he glowered down on me, apparently torpedoed admiral. Right, and so in this exchange, they basically shortened the admiral's chair so that they could get a photo of him being lower, right, being lower than the communist delegation, right. Again, I exchanged my foreshortened chair for a normal one, but not before the communist photographers had exposed reels of film. Such devices by the communists may seem childish when each is considered in isolation. It should be borne in mind, however, that a great multitude of these maneuvers can add up to a propaganda of effective magnitude. Right? So he's saying that you may seem childish, but these photos taken over time and these types of incidents taken over time can contribute to the distortion of reality of the dynamics of the setting. Again, an amusing sequence arose in connection with flags. Just prior to one of the earlier meetings, one of our interpreters placed on the conference table a small standard bearing a handkerchief-sized replica of the United Nations flag. Throughout that session, the communists regarded the miniature flag with suspicion and dislike. Na Emil took occasion repeatedly to push the small standard away from the center of the table. I would casually set it back, dead center. Following a recess, the communists offered an improvement of this game by placing on the table another standard bearing a North Korean flag, identical in all respects to the United Nations emblem, except that it rose some 6 inches higher. Right, and so you can see here that everything, everything and anything is a bit of a game, right? Anything and everything is a bit of a game, and they're constantly trying to insert dominance, right? We talked about this before about gap, gap-ul relationship, and in every relationship there's the gap and there's the ul, and the gap gets to assert dominance whenever they want, no matter how petty or childish, right? And that's what all of this is sort of about. All the United Nations Command delegations speculated with amusement as to where an increase in the height of the United Nations Command standard would lead. I hastened to veto any tendency towards such competition, thereby perhaps averting construction of the 2 tallest flagpoles on Earth. Right, and the admiral, using common sense, says, well, we can't continue on these childish ways because it's gonna turn into a pissing contest. Who can have the largest flagpole, right? So again, he talks about another example. On another occasion, we sent out our Korean liaison officer to deliver a message to the communists at Panmunjom. Chang and Taizé met Colonel Lee, and there Lee was an able linguist speaking English, Korean, Chinese, Japanese, and some German. On this occasion, Lee chose to speak in English. Chang lost his temper. "Are you not Korean?" he shouted. "Why do you not speak Korean?" Lee answered calmly, "I will speak in whatever language I wish. That is what we are fighting for, freedom of speech." Taizé seemed somewhat amused by this exchange. Right? And you could see here not only the North Koreans' disdain and disgust, right, for anybody who would speak anything other than the pure Korean language of the pure Korean people. Because if you look at, if you go and you look at Brian Meyer's book, what is it called, The Purest Race, or The Cleanest Race, it talks about how North Korean ideology is based on this ethno-nationalism, right? Ethnic nationalism, that they are the one race, the pure race, the one culture, and it's the invasion of outsiders that have caused them to fall from paradise, and they need to get rid of the outsiders in order to achieve paradise again. And here you have the North Korean lecturing the South Korean about, well, you shouldn't adapt any kind of other types of cultural ways, right? Korean, right? You should speak Korean because you're ethnically Korean. Don't speak English. Don't speak German. You're a traitor. You're a race traitor. You're a traitor to your race for speaking English. All right. So if we move on to what he talks about is the second principle, a loaded agenda. Right? And if you have an agenda, like say you're going to come and do a debate or speak with somebody for negotiations, you have to at least agree upon sort of the rules of the game before they get started, right? And the rules of the game, or the topics to be discussed that are not going to be discussed. And here you have the first submission by the UN delegation. They submitted. It says, "We submit, place the game is to be played." So he gives an example. Place the game is to be played. Time the game is to start. And 3, the selection of umpires. We're going to discuss these things. The communists would, however, submit an agenda like this. 1, agreement that the game is to be played in Shanghai. 2, agreement that the game be played at night. 3, agreement that umpires be Chinese officials. Consistent with their concept of an agenda as a set of conclusions, the communists formally proposed the following as the first items for discussion. When people talk about what does North Korea want, well, here you go. establishment of 38th parallel as the military demarcation line between both sides, and establishment of a demilitarized zone as basic conditions for cessation of hostilities in Korea. Right? Not unification. They don't want unification, unless it's under them, of course. 2, the withdrawal of all armed forces of foreign countries from Korea. Right? So they've been stating this for a long time. Withdrawal of all armed forces of foreign countries from Korea. Right? They want to return to the state prior to their act of aggression and their invasion of the South. So now Emil supported that 2 points by simply asserting that they were basic and inseparable. He said that the withdrawal of foreign troops from Korea was a basic step toward peace. And so, the Admirable speaks a little bit more about, just how ludicrous this idea of their agenda is. Thus, the communist concept of an agenda was a set of conclusions which would restore the situation in Korea to that obtaining before they launched their aggression. In contrast, note that agenda proposals made by the United States Command on the same day in connection with the same 2 points. So this is their agenda recommendation. Agreement on a demilitarized zone across Korea, cessation of hostilities and acts of armed force under conditions which will assure against resumption of hostilities in Korea. All right, so you can see there's this definitely a conflict of even the approach to negotiations, right? They're not even starting off playing the same game. They're not even trying to play by the same rules, all right? And then when the U.S. and North Korea go into negotiations again, and let's assume that these have been ongoing behind the scenes as well, but this is going to be on at the big stage, so to speak. We're probably going to see a bit of all of this: agenda setting, stage setting, and then now the next part, which is incidents. Once again, so the Admiral Turner has a few examples here of incidents, right? So this is the creation of controversy, the creation of drama, in order to, I guess, embarrass, to gain the higher ground, and basically win the negotiations through other tactics, right? Other than, I guess you would say, reason or logic. This is a different type of tactic that has its reason and logic behind it, but it's just not what the UN is expecting. Once again, once negotiations have actually begun, communists are not satisfied to allow matters to proceed in a climate of peace and calm. Rather, they create incidents calculated to provide advantage for them, negotiating efforts, or for their basic propaganda objectives, or for both. Such incidents do not simply occur, they are plotted and triggered by the communist negotiating teams. There are 2 purposes: negotiating advantage and propaganda are usually served equally by this. So then he goes into a few examples here. So on the morning of August 4th, the United Nations Command delegation was proceeding towards the Kaesong Tea House, in which the meetings were held. Our convoy was halted in mid-course while an entire company of about 100 heavily armed Chinese, complete with machine guns and mortars, marched across our path and through the immediate conference area. This was in flagrant violation of the commitments made to General Ridgway by the communist commanders only 2 weeks earlier. The point of this demonstration seemed to be that, notwithstanding verbal agreements to keep the conference area free of armed men, no one would be allowed to forget the hard fact that the communist military forces actually surrounded and controlled the area. So again, on August 19th, the communist liaison officers established contact with our own, charging that a Chinese security patrol in the newly established Kaesong neutral zone had been attacked by United Nations command troops. Investigation revealed that a Chinese patrol of about 15 men had been fired from ambush, and the leader killed a short distance within the imaginary circle of neutrality around Kaesong. Now, he goes on to state, the communists had previously informed our liaison officers that individuals hostile to the armistice negotiations were living in the Kaesong neutral zone. A few members of my staff suspected that the communists might have arranged the incident themselves, using their own troops. Despite all evidence to the contrary, the communists loudly trumpeted a charge of wanton attack by the United Nations Command. The new pattern had emerged. The communist plan now was to invoke sympathy of the world by alleging fictitious brutalities perpetrated by the United Nations Command. All right, so you can see the dynamic here. If at any moment, right, the North Koreans start to lose the propaganda battle, right, if they start to lose public opinion, if they start to seem to be on the defensive, if the United States seems to have the high ground, they will pull out of the negotiations, if they ever intended to negotiate to begin with, or there will be an incident, right? Incident, agenda setting, and we'll go through some more of these tactics later. But anything and everything, basically to get the United States to make a mistake. One of our officials, even someone related to the delegation, makes a mistake, right? Or what they perceive as a mistake, and then portray it as a mistake, or portray it as a U.S. misstep. Right? That's what was going on with Pence, and that's what is again going to go on now. And so looking forward, I would encourage everybody to watch the negotiations and watch the reporting surrounding the negotiations and how the manipulation of perception takes place, because it's going to be very interesting going forward. Because the North Koreans are not going to denuclearize. They're just not. There's no way they will. Right? Because it's tied in with their ideological legitimacy. Right? And it's also, they see it as their only tool for security in the region. And so they're going to look for an out. They're going to look for a way to draw out the talks, possibly embarrass the United States, embarrass the South Koreans, embarrass President Moon, and win points with who? Who are they trying to win points? They're not trying to win points with the U.S. public, although they're interested in that sometimes, I guess, insofar as that it embarrasses Trump or removes power from Trump. They're interested in winning the support of the Korean people at large around the world. That is their audience. The audience is not Americans. All right, so let's remember who their audience is. All right, and let's remember the incredible amount of distrust, and I don't want to say contempt, but there's a lot of distrust. There's a lot of anger in South Korea because of the most recent tariffs that were brought about by the Trump administration. Right, so there's a lot of factors here at play. There's a lot going on, and it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. So thank you for joining us today on what North Korea wants, right, and what they want from negotiations, and how to negotiate with communists.